Recorded, edited, and produced by John Loth. The Evolution of Civilizations by Carroll Quigley. Chapter 9. Classical Civilization. Classical civilization, which occupied the shores of the Mediterranean Sea for almost a millennium and a half, 950 BC to AD 550, follows the pattern of 7 stages fairly closely, with no major distortions of the process. The only significant variation arises from the shape of the Mediterranean Sea itself, and this would not have given rise to a major distortion if it had not been reinforced by the fact that the Phoenicians, who provided the original impetus toward a revival of civilization in the Mediterranean basin, came from the extreme eastern end of the sea. At a glance at any map of the Mediterranean shows that it consists of 2 great basins divided by the line Calabria, Sicily, Tunis. This geographic schism was strengthened in the historic period by the fact that the eastern basin became Greek-speaking, while the western basin became Latin. Most important of all, since classical civilization originated near Phoenician influence in the eastern part of the eastern basin and spread along the west-running seaways, the core area and the peripheral areas of Mediterranean civilization became separated from each other by more than the usual chronological lag. Cultural distinctions, as well as chronological ones, are characteristic of these 2 portions of any civilization, but usually the periphery tends to surround the core, and such extreme geographic separation does not arise. This fact was, of course, also important in Canaanite civilization, where the core was in the Levant, while the universal empire arose in the west. In classical civilization, the tendency for the society to split into eastern and western parts was always strong. It was counterbalanced, until the society was in its final stage, by the relative superiority of water transportation over land transportation. As a consequence of this, any part of the Mediterranean shore was likely to be more closely linked with any other part than it would be by land communications with its own hinterlands. The instrument of expansion of classical civilization was a social organization, slavery. This came into existence in the period of mixture as a consequence of the invasions of the Iron Age intruders. It remained an instrument so long as the slave owners worked closely with their slaves, often in the fields themselves, as Cincinnatus was doing when appointed dictator. Because then the surplus from the slave labor, which accumulated to the owner from his legal rights over his slaves, could be used for some productive use, since the owner's personal knowledge of the agricultural process permitted him to judge where such investment could best be made. But in the latter period, when the slaves were operated in gangs in charge of a steward, usually a freed slave, with the owner absent from the estate for long periods, output suffered, investment decreased or was improperly applied, and expansion slowed up. After several centuries of this, the slave system became a highly inefficient method of agricultural production, with output expressed either in terms of unit areas or in terms of labor expended, considerably below that of neighboring farms operated by their owners on a family basis. Pliny tells us that output per area was much greater on family farms than it was on latifundia. Slave owners, whose prestige, economic independence, and leisure for political activity depended on their slaves, were determined to resist any efforts to free their slaves or to divide up their estates into family-sized farms. The argument for greater production would have left them unmoved even if it had been made. Even if the landlords had obtained compensation for loss of their lands and slaves, there was no other practical way in which they could have invested their funds because of the great technological backwardness of the classical economy. This excluded redistribution of land and freeing of slaves as practical, large-scale alternatives to the latifundia system, and meant that the system could not be liquidated by any voluntary method, but only by confiscation and violence, as finally occurred. But before it did occur, classical civilization had been destroyed by the struggles over this issue, and especially by the vain efforts of the slave-owning group to prevent their own liquidation as a social and economic group. Moreover, replacement of the latifundia by peasant farms would have been no real solution, because it would have resulted in a more equitable distribution of the society's income and ended most accumulation of capital. The only good solution was replacement of the slave institution by another instrument of expansion, but that meant the replacement of classical civilization by another civilization. It has sometimes been argued that slavery could not possibly have played the central role in classical civilization, which we are attributing to it, because the number of slaves in the society was relatively small, and many of them were well treated, or were used in essentially non-productive activities such as household tasks. These objections are quite beside the point, and are unconvincing even when they are supported by elaborate statistical studies. Such statistical studies are based on the available written evidence, mostly Athenian, and do show that slaves were only a minority of the Athenian population, about 1/4, and were often household servants. Such studies overlook less specific evidence tending to show that the percentage of slaves was probably higher in many rural areas, especially in Dorian states. In Sparta, for example, the number of helots was certainly several times the number of Spartan citizens, even in the early period, and the proportion increased in the later period as the number of Spartan citizens decreased. And in Roman Italy, there is good evidence that the countryside lost much of its peasant population and increased its number of slaves during several centuries following the end of the Second Punic War, 201 BC. Moreover, even if the most moderate estimates produced by the later-day apologists for classical slavery are taken as correct, this in no way would reduce the significance of slavery as the instrument of expansion of classical civilization. All that we require of such an instrument is that it be an important, or perhaps the most important, mechanism in accumulating and investing savings in the society. Such a role, I believe, cannot be withheld from classical slavery. Other organizations performed similar functions in Mediterranean civilization as they do in all societies, but the important role played by slavery in the organizational dynamics of classical antiquity can hardly be denied. The attempts to deny it, which are frequently quite emotional, even when they are made by classicists who pride themselves on their objectivity, are but one class of examples of a notable weakness in classical studies. This weakness arises from the failure of the average classicist to seek a complete and rounded view of classical society. Instead, it is usual to specialize one's attention on a few aspects of the subject, preferably on literature or philosophy or archaeology, or even on only part of one of these, on Greek thought but not on Latin, on Plato but not on Virgil, on Aristotle but not on Theophrastus or Pythagoras or Archimedes, on Athenian excavations but not on Anatolian or Etruscan ones. And of course, students who deal with these humanists areas have little time for other aspects of classical society, such as science or mathematics or education, and are most unlikely to have any concern with such mundane matters as technology, economic organization, or the dynamics of social classes. Yet no adequate picture of classical antiquity can be reconstructed without attention to all its aspects. This is a weakness in classical studies that has been remedied to some extent in recent years, but certainly not sufficiently remedied. We still hear a good deal of emotional talk about the Greek miracle or the Greek genius. The Greek miracle is a term applied to the erroneous belief that Greek culture sprang up fully formed in no more than a couple of generations out of complete barbarism. This is based upon erroneous ideas about the nature of Greek culture, the speed with which it arose, and the background from which it emerged. To mention only one point, any culture that came from a mixture of Cretan, Phoenician, and Indo-European elements did not start from nothing, or from barbarism. As for Greek genius, there can be no doubt that for a brief period, for a select social group, in a restricted area, There was a great opportunity for men to develop their higher capacities, but there is no need for awestruck tones implying that some hereditary biological burst of genius hit like lightning among the Greeks in classical antiquity, without leaving any traces of its passage among their descendants over the next 2,000 years. The importance of the Minoan-Mycenaean contribution to Greek culture can hardly be overemphasized. From it came many later ideas about the gods and much mythology. Not only did the mythology provide the materials for later Greek art and literature, but Homer, who came from this earlier world, remained the inspiration and model of the Greeks throughout their history. This is of the greatest importance. Homer was not only the earliest figure in Greek literature, he was also the latest figure in earlier literature. There is nothing primitive, experimental, or unsophisticated in Homer. His poems are not popular folk epics. They are aristocratic heroic sagas. Their chief figures are emancipated, free from social restraints, individualistic, far removed from any tribe or clan with its unexamined social customs or its clinging to the routine of static social life, and equally free from any materialistic concerns and from the superstitions and social taboos of economic gain. Their gods are humanistic, and their society is secularized. These are barbarians who have taken over the wealth of the Minoan society and are breaking it up, just as their own tribal units have already broken up. They are enjoying their new and unearned wealth, power, and freedom. They have a joy in life and pride in individual brilliance. They have freed themselves completely from the customs of their barbarian forebears. They have no understanding or sympathy for customs of the submerged lower classes who support them. They are completely unconcerned with problems of production, with the origin of the wealth they enjoy, with population pressures. Freed from such concerns, they occupy themselves with self-expression and the pursuit of honor and personal glory. This is an aristocratic outlook that ever after dominated Greek culture. This outlook was, as we have said, Mycenaean, but beneath it was an older, more elegant, yet more irrational tradition, closer to nature, and thus both more concrete, more colorful, but at the same time less free, and much closer to magic, superstition, and the fertility rites associated with the mysteries of agricultural production. This is the Minoan tradition. From this Minoan tradition comes much that we regard as typically Greek: love of nature, of the sun-drenched land and the mysterious sea. But it also provided the rural superstitions, the mystery rites of fertility, the orgies dimly associated with the intoxicants of Bacchus, or the behavior excesses of Dionysus. The best of this tradition is found in Homer's literary expressions, figures of speech, and use of images. Artistic representation of these can be found in the art of the Minoan period and in the words of Homer. From the latter it passed on to the Greeks, so that when they, for example, thought of death and resurrection, they thought of the poppy dropping with its seeds, as the Minoans depicted it, or as Homer described it. Classical culture is a Greek creation. More accurately, it is an Ionian creation, and became Greek largely because the culture created by the Ionians was generally accepted by the literate and cultivated classes of all Greek-speaking peoples. This can be seen in the general admiration of Homer or Plato. Though this Greek culture was accepted by the Romans, it always remained for them an adopted culture, a garment that was put on and could be cast off without ever becoming an intimate or essential part of the wearer. Thus, the history of the culture of the Romans, for example, in religion, is largely the history of how they found and adopted Greek culture. This history began only at a late date, about 200 BC, when the Romans began to learn Greek. It reached its peak about 50 BC, and Cicero, because Cicero fell in love with Greek culture and acquired a deep knowledge of Greek thought and the Greek language, without, it might be added, allowing these ever to become his own nature and outlook. Roman cultural history began to decline when Cicero died in a typically Roman way, murdered 43 BC. And it moved downward exactly in step with the decrease in Roman knowledge of Greek culture, with their decreasing interest in its message, and most obviously, with the decrease in knowledge of the Greek language among educated Romans. This decrease in knowledge of Greek by Latin-speaking people marked not only a decline in Roman culture, it also marked the beginnings of the split between the Latin world and the Greek world, which later appeared as a split between the Western Roman Empire, which disappeared in the 5th century, and the Eastern Roman, or Byzantine Empire, which disappeared only in the 15th century, as well as the schism of the Christian Church into Roman and Orthodox branches that continues today. The Ionian culture that was adopted as their own by the Greek-speaking world and put on like a garment by the Latin-speaking world was never the culture of the whole Mediterranean basin, because it was the culture of the literate upper classes only. These were the slave-owning minority, who knew how to read and write, who had leisure, and who used that leisure to read Homer, Plato, Cicero, and Virgil. The great mass of the inhabitants of the Mediterranean world did not share this culture. They were born, worked, had children, and died. This great mass included the rural inhabitants at all times, and even the majority of city dwellers at most times. In other words, the classical culture we so esteem was the culture of a small minority of city dwellers, except for a brief period of a century and a half, 480 to 330 BC, in Athens. In this brief period, it may be that the majority of the inhabitants of that city had some idea of what we call classical culture. Otherwise, in other cities generally, and in rural areas always, the masses of the people lived in a morass of ignorance and superstition that is difficult for us to imagine. To them, life was an irrational chaos of conflicting powers and forces, of which the chief were a myriad of local gods and spirits. This substratum of irrationality and localism beneath the veneer of classical culture must always be kept in mind if we are to appreciate properly the great achievement of the small minority that possessed this culture, and if we are to understand how this culture was destroyed when this minority was crushed and finally submerged by the rising tide of materialism, ruralism, and irrationality. Classical culture was a class culture, and it was an urban culture. This was almost inevitable at a time when there was no general system of education, so that the majority was illiterate, and when all written material had to be copied by hand because of the lack of printing, so that it was too expensive for the majority to possess. Even for the minority, most information came through conversation. Classical culture was also isolated from the economic activities of everyday life, because it was an urban culture at a time when the city had no real economic function, but was completely dependent for its economic support on the agricultural activities of the rural areas. The city did not pay for its agricultural imports by industrial exports or by commercial activities as a modern city does, except in a few cases, of which the chief, once again, is Athens during the period 480 to 300 BC. Otherwise, as a usual thing, the city existed as an economic parasite on the country and was able to import food because of its political or legal position rather than because of its economic activities. This is merely another way of saying that classical culture was a class culture, possessed by a small minority of city residents whose legal and political rights permitted them to make economic demands on the rural population, and who were able to build up classical culture because their legal rights gave them the leisure to do so. The key to this leisure and to their privileged position is to be found in slavery. Many years ago, I took an amazing course in which the whole history of German culture, its literature, music, art, and sculpture, was covered in a single semester, from September to January. The most amazing thing about this course was not the amount that was attempted or the professor who taught it, but how successfully it was done. As we raced along, Goethe was covered in 15 minutes, Schiller in 10, Fichte in 5. Later, I tried to analyze how this had been done, and realized that the professor had a profound understanding of much that he discussed, and that he covered any topic simply by slicing it up into a small number of parts, and giving a name to each part. The complex character and achievement of Goethe, for example, were divided into 6 portions. Each was given a title, and ever after, the whole of Goethe could be evoked merely by reciting 6 words. The cultural synthesis that the Ionians created and handed on to the Greeks, and that, however modified, remained very largely the culture of all of classical antiquity, is surely more complex than Goethe. But I should like to outdare even my former professor by dividing this greater complexity into only 5 parts. It seems to me that classical culture was aristocratic. It was clarid, it was urban, it was balanced, and it was mundane. One of these words will not be found in any dictionary. When I say that classical culture was clarid, I mean that it was lucid, clear, rational, in some ways like the Mediterranean sunlight, infusing the atmosphere to an astounding clarity. When we say that classical culture was aristocratic, we mean much more than it was the possession of an upper-class minority. We mean that this culture refused to regard either profit or power as goals of life, but rather tended to regard honor and the esteem of one's equals as at least equally worthy goals. It was quite willing to accept a goal for life and an organization of life that functioned economically on a deficit basis, that could not be made available to all men or was not comprehensible to all men, but that had to be supported by many men who could neither share in it nor understand it. This point of view had an aversion to anything practical or vocational. It regarded its goal, honor, as one whose appeal is not, like wealth or power, automatically appreciated, but one that is achieved by breeding and discipline. It regarded man as by nature close to the gods, but very remote from the animals. It did not accept the equality of men, but did insist on a fraternity of equals within the select group of participants. It emphasized the dignity of the individual, at first only the individual within the chosen group, but later, as democratic influences spread, it tended to grant equality and individual dignity to all, not by bringing the outlook of ordinary men into the select group, but rather by spreading the outlook of the select group outward to ordinary men. To do this, it was necessary, while allowing the select group to grow constantly larger, to continue to emphasize the superiority of the members of the group over outsiders. At first, the group consisted only of those of noble birth. Later, it was the citizens of the city-state. As this group was expanded, emphasis continued on the distinction between free men and slaves, between Greek and barbarian, between those who had the political franchise and those who lacked it. Only when classical culture was in its decline, after the time of Christ, did it begin to accept the equality of all men. Even then, it insisted that all men had human dignity, had a kind of divinity, and were worthy of respect. Thus, to the very end, classical culture kept certain elements of its aristocratic outlook, and never, like the Hebrews, came to regard man as a helpless and cringing worm. One last characteristic of an aristocratic outlook that classical culture maintained, to the end, was its belief in social retrogression, rather than its social progress, and its conviction that the golden age was to be found in the past, rather than in the future. This gave the culture an underlying pessimism redeemed by the fact that man's fate, however hopeless, must be borne with dignity. This belief in a past golden age and the refusal to accept the idea of progress is to be found in Homer and Hesiod in a most explicit fashion, and undoubtedly is the result of some dim social memory of the Cretan civilization or of Mycenaean culture. In saying that classical culture was clarid, we mean that it possessed the qualities of rationality, lucidity, and clarity. This culture sought explanations rather than sensations. These explanations were regarded as satisfactory if they led to some concept that could be grasped by man's conscious mind. Thus, for example, the immortality of the gods was explained on the grounds that gods ate a special food, ambrosia, that would also give immortality to men, if they could obtain it. When we say that this culture was urban, we mean that it was possessed by a city-dwelling group who knew one another personally, saw one another frequently, exchanged views by conversation or letter rather than by media of mass communication, were remote from the productive system, either agriculture or commerce, and regarded loyalty to the state and to its gods as the chief duty and chief privilege of existence. When we say that this culture was balanced, we mean that it held the golden mean in high esteem, that it regarded excess or extremes with distaste, and felt that such excess could lead only to disaster and to retribution. The expression golden mean, the motto nothing too much, the idea that excess leads to retribution, nemesis, these are all derived from classical culture. This ideal of balance appeared in their ethics as nemesis, in their politics as the idea that justice was a balance of different elements, in their art as the principle of proportion, in their literature, especially the drama, as the idea that nemesis is always the consequence of hubris, excess of personal pride, and self-exaltation, in their social outlook, in the belief that society was a balance of different groups or classes. When we say that this culture was mundane, we mean that it was humanistic, anthropocentric, and this worldly. It regarded man as the center of everything. It interpreted everything in terms of human aims. It had no real concern with life after death or with the gods, and had no real idea of eternity or of reward or punishment in the afterlife. It had no real idea of the nature of divinity until very late, and then achieved this idea as a consequence of an aristocratic pursuit of truth, a rationalistic pursuit by men with leisure and with no real regard for wealth or power. This mundane character of classical culture meant that this culture, in extreme cases, was materialistic in its outlook, but it was able to escape the ordinary consequences of materialism because of its ideals of aristocracy and moderation. The creation of this synthesis from past elements, some of which, like Minoan or Mesopotamian, had a long history, explained why there were so few primitive elements in Greek culture and why, when these elements did occasionally emerge from the submerged or rural masses, as in the mystery religions, they were immediately modified or rejected. This also explains why the oldest surviving Greek writer, Homer, was neither primitive nor unsophisticated, but had a simplicity, a gravity, a balance, a dignity, a subtlety that made him appear as the culmination of a long epic tradition and the last example of a sophisticated culture. This indeed he was, a kind of post-mortem manifestation of the Mycenaean age, looking back on it as a golden age, but nonetheless writing in Greek and thus capable of becoming, as he did, the model for the future classical culture.